and you saw the balcony, and sure enough, someone came out, and it was that French bishop. And I heard our name.
The world waited. In silence. In prayer. In hope. Billions of eyes watched the ancient Vatican chimney for the sign that would shape the future of the Catholic Church. And when the white smoke rose, history unfolded. But not in the way many had dared to believe. It wasn't the moment of triumph that millions of Catholics across Asia had longed for. It wasn't the moment that would lift an entire continent into the heart of the Holy See. It was something else. A culmination of expectation, heartbreak, and spiritual resilience. In that singular moment, a name was spoken from the balcony that hovered above St. Peter's Square. It was not Luis Antonio Tagle. It was Robert Francis Prevost. And the world, which had been holding its breath, exhaled in a mixture of reverence and stunned stillness. But behind the scenes, behind the solemnity and the ceremonial gravitas, there was a man and almost pope standing not in resentment, but in grace. This is the story of Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. Not the Pope of 2025, but perhaps the conscience of it. It began with fire and smoke. The kind of ritual that has echoed through centuries, drawing generations together in sacred anticipation. The Sistine Chapel, cloaked in divine symbolism, had once again become the epicenter of the Catholic world. The conclave of 2025 was not just another vote. It was a turning point. A fork in the path of history. The Catholic Church, in the wake of Pope Francis' passing, stood at a crossroads. Reform or tradition? Voice or silence? Expansion or preservation? And in that fragile space between choices, emerged the prayerful cries of millions across the Philippines, Asia, and the global South. They weren't just praying for a candidate. They were praying for a reflection. A reflection of themselves in the highest role the Church could offer. And that reflection bore the name Luis Antonio Tagle. Vigils lit up across cities from Manila to Mumbai. Churches filled before dawn. Social media burst alive with hope. Not only from Filipino believers but from Catholics in Nigeria, Brazil, and beyond. In the humble, soft-spoken man from Imus, they saw a symbol of humility. Of bridge building, of a future church that spoke more with its hands and heart than with its scepter and crown. Want to understand the Bible easily? Read my book Bible Decoded, loved by thousands of Christians. Link in description. Yet, when the white smoke billowed, when the bells rang out and the words Habemus Papam echoed across stone and soul, it wasn't Tagle who stepped onto that historic balcony. It was another man, another vision. And in that exact moment, a collective dream paused. Not broken, but transformed. Few moments in recent church history were as emotionally complex as the one that followed the announcement. Cameras scanned the crowds, searching for reactions. There were cheers, of course, there always are. But they were softer than usual. Mixed with sighs. Behind the chants of joy lay a quieter note, a minor key. Somewhere deep within that moment was the ghost of another possibility. The dream of an Asian pope, whispered for decades, had once again been deferred. And where was Cardinal Tagle? For hours, there was no official word. No tweet. No address. No sight of the man whose name had trended across every media outlet from CNN to Vatican Insider. But when he did appear, calm, composed, and yet visibly emotional, it was not to protest or question. It was to speak. Not of disappointment, but of unity. Not of loss, but of love. In a small chapel just outside Vatican grounds, surrounded by Filipino pilgrims and journalists who had followed his journey for years, Cardinal Tagle stepped forward. His voice, always gentle, now carried a tremor. Not of sadness, but of sacred responsibility. He spoke of God's will. Of trusting the Spirit. Of how leadership is not measured by position, but by service. And then, with tears in his eyes and a trembling smile, he said, "To be almost Pope is not failure. To remain a servant is a victory greater than the throne." Those words reverberated far beyond that room. They were quoted in headlines, turned into prayer cards, etched into memory. Because in them was something rare in our age: authentic grace. For many, Cardinal Tagle's near election wasn't a loss, it was a revelation. A moment that unveiled a deeper truth about the Church's future. That the world is watching. That Catholics from every language, skin color, and background are not only hoping for change, they are ready to lead it. The media didn't let the moment pass. Commentators spoke of Tagle's powerful theological roots, his pastoral charisma, his connection to the marginalized and the youth. "He is the Pope the world almost had," wrote one European outlet. "And in his composure, we saw the heart of a future church," wrote another. And yet, no bitterness colored his path. In the days following the conclave, Cardinal Tagle returned to his duties without pause. No special interviews. No cryptic comments. He returned not as a man defeated, but as one reanointed in humility. A living testimony that greatness is not always clothed in titles. If the measure of a man is found not in his triumphs, but in how he responds to what the world calls disappointment, then Cardinal Luis Tagle stands taller than many who have worn the papal white. Because in the days that followed, the world did not see a broken man, nor a bitter man. It saw a servant. A servant who returned to the altar, to the people, to the very calling that had brought him to the threshold of the papacy in the first place. He didn't demand attention, yet he received it. He didn't seek sympathy, yet millions empathized. Children in Manila drew his face in their notebooks and whispered prayers for his strength. Elders in hidden corners of Southeast Asia wept. Not out of defeat, but out of shared longing. Young priests and seminarians across Africa and Latin America referenced him in their homilies. Not as the Pope they had hoped for, but as the pastor they still followed. In many ways, his silence spoke more loudly than any speech could. There was no press conference filled with sorrowful resignation. No emotional backlash, no hidden interviews with veiled frustration. There was only peace. A kind of peace that only comes from a soul anchored not in ambition, but in God. That kind of witness shakes walls. And in the Vatican's marbled corridors, that kind of peace is not always common. But when it arrives, it leaves a mark. Inside the Sistine Chapel, where Michelangelo's frescoes tower over sacred whispers, history was forged in secret. 133 cardinal electors from every continent cast their votes over multiple ballots. No cameras. No microphones. Only the spirit and centuries of tradition watching closely. Though the vote counts remain sealed, the rumors swirl like incense. Some say Cardinal Tagle led in the early ballots, gaining surprising momentum. Others believe his name lingered near the top until the final vote, edged out by a margin so slim it could only be divine in design. Analysts speculated, news anchors debated, and Vatican correspondents traced every movement with surgical precision. Still, nothing could alter the fact that when the smoke cleared, it was Cardinal Robert Prevost who emerged, not as a compromise, but as a surprise. A quiet leader from the Americas, a missionary bishop, a scholar of hidden influence. And the question echoed, what happened behind those walls? No answer has come. Nor will it. That is the mystery of the conclave. But for millions watching, the deeper answer was already forming, not in statistics, but in symbolism. In the quiet dignity of the man who almost became Pope. The Church saw what leadership could look like when stripped of power. A man unafraid to lose the title but unwilling to lose his soul. Luis Tagle had already become more than a name on a ballot. Long before the 2025 conclave, he was shaping the Church's conscience. Born in Manila in 1957, Tagle rose not through wealth or political maneuvering, but through compassion, intellect, and unwavering fidelity to Christ. He spoke not with volume, but with truth. His homilies rarely made headlines, but they often made hearts tremble. As Archbishop of Manila and later as prefect of the Congregation for the Evangelization of Peoples, Tagle traveled across the globe with one mission: to listen. Not just to speak, but to listen. He sat with the poor, dined with the forgotten, wept with the persecuted. He preached the gospel in a way that felt less like a command and more like an invitation. And people responded. Not because he was powerful, but because he was real. And when his name began to surface as a possible papal candidate, it wasn't because he desired it. It was because he had already lived it. Because being a shepherd was not something he aspired to, it was something he breathed. Pope Leo XIV, formerly Robert Francis Prevost, stepped into the papacy not as a media darling or a celebrity bishop, but as a man of profound formation and missionary heart. Born in Chicago, forged in the missions of Peru. Shaped by the ancient discipline of the Augustinian order, Pope Leo represents a different kind of papal presence. He is American, yes, but his soul is global. Fluent in Spanish, humble in demeanor, and rooted in the idea that shepherds must smell like their sheep. His election surprised many, but shocked few who truly knew the Church's heartbeat. He was not the expected successor, but perhaps he was the necessary one. The world watched closely as he stood on the balcony of St. Peter's for the first time. His smile was gentle, his words careful, his hands folded in prayer. And while millions wondered what kind of pope he would be, others quietly felt a shift, not away from Tagle, but because of him. Because this wasn't a rejection of Tagle, it was a revelation. A sign that the Church is moving. That voices from Asia and the global south are not peripheral, they are central. That the Spirit moves not only in elections, but in every echo of love that follows. If 2025 taught the world anything, it is this: holiness does not require victory. In fact, sometimes the most powerful witness comes not from those who ascend, but from those who kneel. Cardinal Tagle carried the hopes of a continent and bore the weight of an unspoken prophecy. And though he did not become pope, he carried that burden with the grace of a saint. The title almost pope may sound tragic to some, but in truth, it is beautiful. Because he was never running a race. He was walking a path. And now, that path continues. Perhaps not toward the throne of Peter, but toward something just as sacred, the hearts of the faithful. He remains a cardinal, a pastor, a father, a teacher, and now, more than ever, a symbol. A symbol of what it means to be faithful even when the world says, not yet. A symbol of what it means to be great without being crowned. And a living challenge to all who serve: will you serve only if you win? Or will you serve because you were called? In the days that followed the election, headlines slowly faded, the media's gaze moved elsewhere, and analysts returned to their normal rotations. But for those who lived this moment with hearts fully invested, the real story was just beginning. Because something had been awakened across dioceses, across nations, across hearts. The conversations didn't die down. Instead, they evolved. No longer limited to speculation about who would wear white. People began to ask deeper questions about the future of the Church. What does leadership look like in a time of global disillusionment? What does holiness mean in an age when fame can imitate virtue? And what can the Church learn from a man who stood so close to power, yet never lost sight of purpose? Cardinal Tagle had unwittingly become a mirror. A reflection for bishops who feared being forgotten, for missionaries who served in obscurity, for lay leaders who wondered if their quiet devotion mattered. His witness was not loud, but it was thunderous in its reach. He was not the Pope, but he had become something more intimate. A spiritual companion for a generation struggling with disappointment, spiritual fatigue, and the aching desire for a church that feels like home. When Cardinal Tagle returned to the Philippines, he did not do so with fanfare. There were no triumphant parades or formal addresses. He simply resumed his ministry. His first act? Visiting a small chapel outside Manila, sitting in silent prayer with a group of elderly women who prayed the rosary for him every day of the conclave. He knelt beside them, not as a global figure, but as a brother in faith. They cried not because he had lost, but because he had remained the same. Humble. Present. Grateful. This moment went viral not because it was broadcast, but because someone captured it quietly, respectfully. A single photo. A cardinal on his knees beside his people. And in that one image, the world saw what the church so desperately needs: leaders who are not ashamed to be small. That photo was reposted millions of times. It was framed in Catholic schools. It was printed in bulletins from Nairobi to New York. Because it answered a question many were asking. What does it mean to lead in the image of Christ? It means to serve. Even when the crown goes to another. Even when the cameras turn away. Even when your name is no longer on the news crawl. To serve, because service is the gospel made flesh. Meanwhile, Pope Leo XIV settled into his new role. Rome adjusted to his presence, journalists dug into his past, and the Vatican began to reorient its rhythm around his leadership. But from the very beginning, his actions showed something striking: this was not a papacy of entitlement. It was a mission. He cancelled several ceremonial events, choosing instead to meet quietly with representatives from regions torn by poverty and persecution. He invited global religious leaders into personal, unbroadcast conversations. He issued his first address not in Latin or Italian, but in Spanish, a subtle nod to his years in Latin America and his global outlook. And while some still held reservations about an American occupying the chair of Peter, those fears began to soften. Because this pope was not a politician. He was not a product of Rome's elite circles. He was a man shaped by villages, by confessionals, by the wounds of real people. He began making subtle changes. A renewed focus on pastoral training for bishops. A commitment to transparency in diocesan finances. A call for renewed missionary efforts in secularized cities. And he never mentioned his predecessor candidates by name. But his homilies often reflected a spirit of humility and courage, echoes, perhaps, of Tagle. While the world's attention shifted, Cardinal Tagle's influence grew, not in hierarchy, but in hearts. His speeches began to be translated more widely. His essays on mercy, pastoral care, and intercultural theology were reprinted across seminaries. Bishops began quoting him more frequently in synods and pastoral letters. Young Catholics, especially in Asia and Latin America, began organizing informal Tagle circles, digital and in-person gatherings where people read his work and discussed how to live the gospel in a fractured world. His gentle theology of encounter, meeting people where they are, listening without judgment, guiding without arrogance, resonated in a church that has too often been seen as distant. Tagle's name, once associated with papal possibility, had become synonymous with pastoral fidelity. Not as an icon of disappointment, but as a mentor of quiet transformation. The 2025 conclave was historic not just for who was elected, but for who was considered. Tagle's prominence marked a turning point in church demographics. For the first time, it was undeniable: the global South is not the church's future, it is its present. More Catholics now live in Africa, Asia, and Latin America than in Europe and North America combined. And leaders like Tagle represent this dynamic shift, not as political gestures, but as faithful stewards of living, breathing communities of hope. The election of Pope Leo XIV did not silence that truth. It illuminated it. Because in the tension between the elected and the almost elected, the Church began to see itself more clearly. It began to hear voices that had long gone unheard. It began to sense that unity is not uniformity, and holiness wears many faces. And so, while Pope Leo governs the visible Church, Cardinal Tagle continues shepherding the invisible one, the one that exists in kitchens, on buses, in underground churches and overcrowded chapels. The one that longs for tenderness more than triumph, for meaning more than message, for truth more than title. Together, these two men, Leo and Tagle, now walk parallel paths. Different roles. Same purpose. The former preaches from balconies. The latter whispers from chapels. But both carry the same gospel. And perhaps this is the deeper revelation: that in a church often torn between visionaries and administrators, prophets and protectors, God sometimes gives us both. One to guide. One to inspire. One to act. One to stir hearts. And sometimes, the one we thought should lead ends up being the one who helps us follow more faithfully. In the mystery of the Spirit, no moment is wasted. No path is irrelevant. And no man of God is ever truly passed over. Because in the heart of the church, there is no ladder, only a cross. And those who carry it with love are the ones who lead, whether we call them Pope or not. If you love God and want to grow in faith, grab my book Bible Decoded on Amazon. Link below. Let it change your life. If this content blesses you and you'd like to support our mission, you can buy me a coffee or give a super thanks. Every contribution helps us create more content to inspire and uplift others. Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on my future videos.